的全部内容，下集我们再会。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间7月2日。这期热点深度继续关注郭文贵涉10亿美元欺诈案，庭审进入第26日。据称，7月2日这天，郭文贵在法庭上着军蓝西装、白色衬衫和深灰色领带，顺带还理了个发。出庭的检方证人包括 FBI 的杰西卡·沃尔奇科，他在接受了检方的直接询问后，又接受了郭文贵的律师的交叉询问。之后，轮到辩方的第一位证人雷蒙德·龙出场。这位的证词与 GTV 的估值分析相关。雷蒙德·龙先后接受了辩方和检方的询问。随后，第二位证人马吉·斯克拉尔出场。这位是加密货币和区块链问题专家，在接受完辩方的直接询问后，马吉·斯克拉尔接着接受检方的询问。根据持续追踪该案的媒体内城新闻界在 X 上的更新提到，检察官正在宣读有关家庭影院、床头柜和厨房中岛的信息。随后，内城新闻界提到，估值专家作证说，投资者可能会误导自己，有些担保只是随便说说而已。而在7月1日，华尔街电视热点深度中提到的，检方此前提出申请，将共谋者陈述作为关键证据，法庭随后进行了回应。根据法庭文件，检方递交的共谋者名单中的包括王艳平、于建明、郭强等等和郭文贵紧密相关的名字。虽然辩方提出了反对意见，但在7月1日，根据法庭文件，法院认为，通过在过去5周郭片审判证人证词表明，政府提出了实质性证据，确定由郭文贵及其同谋在实施和促进被指控的罪行犯罪过程中共谋作案成立。法庭中，检方对共谋犯指控成立，共谋犯包括王艳平、于建明、郭强以及喜马拉雅各农场领导成员夏其东、联盟秘书长、香草山农场负责人戴建峰、英喜农场负责人魏立红、凤凰农场负责人张永斌、郭文贵的律师等。另一边，根据媒体 Courthouse News 在7月2日的报道，检方对中国商人郭文贵的指控举证完毕中提到，郭文贵因其狂热的反共宣传而深受美国右派的喜爱。2020年与川普白宫助手史蒂夫·班农合作创办了 GTV。周二，联邦检察官对郭文贵提起的案件举证完毕。郭文贵被控建立了一个庞大的反共追随者群体，然后从他们那里骗取了超过10亿美元。检方称，郭文贵将其各种公司包装成有利可图的投资机会，包括 G Clubs 一个豪华旅行和活动服务，以及 G Fashion 郭文贵的个人服装品牌，出售200美元的棒球帽和800美元的丝裤。他的狂热反共宣传使他成为美国右翼的宠。郭文贵和他的亲密盟友经常出现在保守派新闻网络如 Real America's Voice 上。2020年，郭文贵与川普白宫助手史蒂夫·班农合作创办了 GTV， 一个面向厌倦政府审查的人群的视频流媒体服务。郭文贵向他的粉丝们展示了他奢华的生活方式，并承诺对投资他项目的人给予高回报和奢华福利。然而，检方声称，郭文贵实际上是从他的企业中偷取投资者的资金来资助自己的奢侈生活。政府已经向曼哈顿陪审员展示了近6周的案件。检方提供了多名据称的欺诈受害者的证词，这些受害者共向郭文贵的商业项目投入了数百万美元。证人李珍妮上个月曾作证说，迈尔斯郭偷了我的钱。李的故事与几名检方证人的说法相似。因为对中国共产党的失望，李珍妮在2017年听到郭文贵的广播后被他吸引。不久后，他成为了郭文贵的狂热粉丝，并为投资郭文贵的各种反共项目抵押了他的房子。证人证词显示，郭文贵对他的数千名追随者似乎有神一般的控制力，许多人每天通过直播观看他多次发言，并在有机会时毫不犹豫地给他钱。李作证说，我相信他说的每一句话。 总的来说，李损失了他投入郭文贵公司的10万美元中的大部分，与另一名政府证人周乐相似。他说自己投资了大约同样数额的现金，最终亏损了超过3万美元。周在5月作证说，我想成为其中的一部分，所以我投资了。根据法庭文件，郭文贵的辩护团队希望通过非受害者投资者的证词来反驳李、周及其他政府证人的说法。但检方要求美国地方法官托雷斯禁止这种证词，因为这种证词不合理的具有偏见。检方在6月的一份文件中写道，某些人未能认识到，甚至到今天仍未认识到，他们是诈骗受害者。这一事实与政府需要在审判中证明的内容无关。因此，这种证词的证明价值不存在，而混淆陪审团问题和对政府的不公平偏见的风险很高。郭文贵的律师还计划传唤乔治·希金伯瑟姆，这位前司法部员工在2018年因代表外国利益进行游说而认罪。他将作证关于他在2017年试图说服川普政府将郭文贵遣返中国的阴谋。他的证词部分被政府反对，将涉及郭文贵声称自己被中国共产党针对，并真正相信他向支持者传递的愿景。尽管如此，郭文贵仍面临来自不仅是不满的投资者，还有几名前员工的毁灭性证词。一名助手李亚 （A.K.A. 木兰传奇）是郭文贵的铁血组的成员，这是郭文贵给他的核心圈子起的名字。现在作为政府污点证人的李亚上个月作证说，郭文贵的整个运动都是骗局。辩护团队从7月2日周二开始传唤证人。第一个出庭的是专家证人雷蒙德·龙，他就郭文贵与班农合作的 GTV 项目的评估价值作证。郭文贵被刑事指控包括敲诈勒索阴谋、电汇欺诈、证券欺诈、国际洗钱等罪名。如果罪名成立，他可能面临超过200年的监禁或被遣返中国，在那里他因强奸、绑架和贿赂指控被通缉。好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的6度探索节目。今天我们将探讨一个充满挑战性的话题。前立委郭正亮近日指出，总统赖清德将大陆视为纸老虎，若北京不采取军事行动，绿营将在2026和2028选举中全胜。然而，美丽岛电子报董事长吴子嘉对此猛烈抨击，称郭正亮脑筋坏掉。郭正亮今日回应称，赖清德确实是在赌注，这种紧张局势有助于内部斗争，并批评民进党利用抹红来塑造被害妄想。除此之外，郭正亮还对他与新西兰中文国际频道主持人三妹的互动影片做出了回应，强调这只是吃饭唱歌，并批评台湾政治文化的恶质。请大家继续收看详细内容。各位观众朋友，欢迎收看今天的华尔街争议。在本期特别节目中，我们将深入探讨一则引起广泛关注的新闻事件。这则新闻来源于近日的台湾政治圈，其中涉及到2位重量级人物的激烈言辞交锋。前立委郭正亮和美丽岛电子报董事长吴子嘉就前者发表的纸老虎论展开了一场口水战。事件的起因可以追溯到郭正亮前几日的一次公开发言。在这次发言中，郭正亮提出了一个引人注目的观点，所谓的纸老虎说，他指责现任台湾总统赖清德，认为赖清德将大陆视作一个纸老虎。郭正亮的言下之意是，赖清德吃定大陆，不敢对台湾动武，并且利用这种紧张局势来巩固自身及民进党在未来选举中的地位。郭正亮进一步推测，若大陆在2026年和2028年没有对台湾发动军事行动，民进党不仅将在地方选举中大胜，而赖清德也有望连任。然而，这一观点立刻引发了吴子嘉的强烈反应。吴子嘉毫不客气地批评郭正亮脑筋坏掉，认为他在公然挑衅中共，怂恿大陆对台湾实施武力打击。吴子嘉表示， 尽管他与郭正亮认识多年，但他无法认同郭正亮的这种论调，直言：你在那边戳大陆打台湾吗？哎呦，大陆纸老虎啦！你看你纸老虎不敢打，所以赖清德一直搞你。面对吴子嘉的激烈批评，郭正亮并未退缩，相反，他在今天做出了进一步的回应。郭正亮认为，赖清德确实在赌，通过制造紧张局势来达到内部政治斗争的目的。郭正亮指出，赖清德在执政期间不仅没有改善两岸关系，反而使局势更加紧张，并且通过抹红手段来瓦解其他政党的影响力。他认为，民进党的执政根基正是建立在这种紧张和对抗之上的。值得一提的是，最近社交媒体上流传着郭正亮与新西兰中文国际频道主持人三妹 Summer 的一段互动影片。在影片中，有网友讽刺郭正亮在深圳玩得很开心，并质疑中国是否真的危险，甚至调侃说真正危险的是亮哥的腰部。对此，郭正亮也做出了回应，他强调与三妹纯属朋友关系，并认识她的丈夫多年。他表示自己只是在吃饭唱歌，对于网友的恶质评论感到可笑。他还指出，这种恶质政治文化在台湾和海外并不少见，并对那些在线批评者提出了反击。在这一事件中，我们可以从多个角度来分析和评论。首先，从政治策略的角度来看，郭正亮的纸老虎说无疑是对赖清德的一种深刻批判。郭正亮认为，赖清德通过制造两岸紧张局势来巩固自身权力，这种策略在短期内可能有效，但从长远来看，可能给台湾带来不可预测的风险。值得注意的是，郭正亮的观点并非空穴来风。在过去的几年中，台湾政坛的确出现了以对抗大陆为手段来争取选民支持的现象。赖清德及民进党在执政期间，通过强调台湾的独立性和主权，赢得了不少民众的支持。然而，这种对抗策略也引发了不少争议和批评，尤其是在两岸关系日益紧张的背景下。其次，从两岸关系的角度来看，郭正亮的言论揭示了当前两岸关系的复杂和敏感性。台湾与大陆之间的关系一直以来都是一种微妙的平衡，任何一方的过激言论或行动都可能导致局势的升级。郭正亮的纸老虎说无疑是对大陆的一种挑衅，但也反映出了台湾内部对大陆态度的分歧。吴子嘉的反应则代表了另一种声音，认为不应挑衅大陆，以免引发不可控的后果。再者，从媒体和舆论的角度来看，这次事件再次暴露了台湾政治圈内的激烈斗争和复杂舆论环境。郭正亮与三妹的互动影片在社交媒体上的传播，不仅引发了舆论的广泛关注，也反映了当前社交媒体在政治斗争中的重要性。在这种背景下，任何一段视频，任何一句话都可能被无限放大，成为政治斗争的工具。最后，从个人声誉和形象管理的角度来看，无论是郭正亮还是吴子嘉，他们的言论和行为都在一定程度上影响了他们的公众形象。郭正亮在面对批评时选择了直接反击，这种反应虽然展示了他的自信和勇气，但也可能进一步加剧争议。而吴子嘉的激烈批评虽然表明了他的坚定立场，但也可能被解读为过于情绪化。综上所述，郭正亮与吴子嘉的这场口水战，不仅揭示了台湾政治圈的复杂和敏感，也反映了当前两岸关系的微妙平衡。在这场争论中，我们看到了不同政治立场的碰撞，也看到了个人形象与政治策略的博弈。这一事件的后续发展还需要我们持续关注。感谢各位观众朋友收看今天的华尔街争议，我们将继续关注这一事件的最新动态，并为您带来最全面、最深入的分析和评论。下一期节目再见。前立委郭正亮和美丽岛电子报董事长吴子嘉最近可是把台湾政坛弄得热闹非凡。吴子嘉在节目中提到，郭正亮曾说赖清德把大陆当纸老虎，听得他是两腿发软，不禁脱口而出：“你在戳大陆来打台湾啦？脑袋坏掉啦？”对此，郭正亮也毫不示弱，立刻在直播中回应，指出赖清德的确在赌大陆不会真的动武，他把这种紧张局势当作政坛的把戏，吃定大陆是纸老虎。郭正亮回忆起自己往昔的学术岁月，那可是充满了凉粉、煎饼和研究论文的日子。他在1992年邓小平南巡的那一年，带着耶鲁大学的学术梦想，踏入了上海复旦大学的校园。 那时，他目睹了上海从一个普通的城市迅速崛起的过程，他也几乎每年都回到这个城市，超过30次之多。郭正亮在上海的这些经历，可不像某些民进党支持者那样对中国大陆一无所知，只能靠3名字灌输的片面资讯来理解对岸。民进党每天编故事，像是得了被迫害妄想症。郭正亮一针见血地指出，他认为破这个局其实很简单，只要稍微记得前后的矛盾就行了。他举了一个典型例子，2020年蔡英文选总统时，澳洲爆发的王立强事件。王立强声称和韩国瑜有接触，瞬间把韩国瑜抹红的鲜艳无比。然而，事后经过2年多的调查，澳洲确认王立强是假冒的。这种连续剧式的剧情，格外能说明民进党政府的戏码。民进党讲的两岸关系的事情，至少要隔1个月才能看清真相，刚开始都是乱七八糟的假讯息。郭正亮语气中带着几分无奈，他分析为何会出现这种现象。因为赖清德无法辩护自己的政绩。赖清德当总统已经1个多月了，大家有看到他做什么实在事吗？除了在就职演说中宣布2国论，剩下的时间似乎都在玩斗鸡游戏，一会儿扣国民党扩权违宪帽子，一会儿又准备起诉柯文哲，还要罢免谢国良，甚至在陆军官校100年校庆时，还大谈要抓假黄埔，打倒投降主义。郭正亮对赖清德充满疑问，1个多月的总统任期，竟然把两岸关系搞得如此紧张，把台湾内部政治关系也搞得乌烟瘴气，没有看到任何政绩，也没有减缓民众对战争的恐惧，反而让这种恐惧更深刻。赖清德希望两岸有点紧张，但又不到要打的程度，他吃定大陆是纸老虎。郭正亮直言，吴子嘉在直播中提到他竟然说赖清德在赌大陆是纸老虎，这样的思维确实让人感到寒意阵阵。很不幸，赖清德真的在赌。郭正亮继续分析，赖清德认为这样的紧张局势有助于搞内部斗争，也有助于瓦解民众党部分选民，还让国民党难以有所作为。于是，赖清德和他的团队铺天盖地的抹红对手，塑造一种被害妄想，这就是民进党执政的根基。郭正亮说的豪爽，吴子嘉听得心惊胆战，而台湾的政治局势在这场口水大战中继续着令人瞠目结舌的变换。欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反2个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
大家好，我是楚天舒。首先，我们必须面对一个事实，赖清德将大陆当作纸老虎，这种策略并非毫无根据。老实说，历史上也有类似的案例，比如2战时期的希特勒，他也是通过不断挑衅，试探盟国的底线，最终占领了大半个欧洲。虽然我们不赞同这种做法，但不得不承认，这种策略确实曾经奏效。而且，北京如果真的对台动武，将面临国际上的巨大压力和经济制裁，甚至可能引发全球局势的动荡。赖清德的纸老虎论只是一种政治博弈手段，希望通过制造紧张局势，增强自己的政治资本。
楚天舒，你讲的好像赖清德是个政治天才，但事实上他这种纸老虎论调不仅幼稚，而且危险。你说的希特勒，结果是什么？全世界陷入了战争的深渊，还有数百万人的死亡。赖清德的这种赌注不仅是自我毁灭，更是把整个台湾民众推向战争的悬崖边。况且，现今国际局势复杂多变，不能拿过去的历史案例来强行类比。北京一旦被逼到绝路，恐怕真的会采取疯狂行动。与其玩火，不如冷静下来，寻求和平解决之道。
谢琪琪，我承认你的担忧有其道理，但你忽略了一个关键点，那就是台湾需要在国际上争取更多的支持和认同。赖清德的纸老虎论，某种程度上是为了唤醒国际社会对台海局势的关注。你还记得1971年的联合国大会吗？中国大陆通过一系列外交努力，最终取代台湾成为联合国的成员国。今天，如果台湾继续低调行事，只会更加被国际社会边缘化。赖清德的策略正是为了避免这种情况，争取更多的国际关注和支持。
楚天舒，你的话听上去很有道理， 但实际操作中风险远比收益大。你说争取国际支持，但别忘了，国际社会的支持往往是口惠而实不至。看看乌克兰的例子，面对俄罗斯的侵略，有多少国家真的敢于站出来直接对抗俄罗斯？台湾能指望的只有自己，靠纸老虎论来博取国际支持，这无异于在玩火。历史上，玩火者往往自焚。赖清德的策略不但不会增强台湾的国际地位，反而可能引发更大的危机。
谢琪琪，你说的好像台湾只能任人鱼肉，但实际上，台湾和大陆之间的博弈已经持续了几十年。赖清德的纸老虎论只是试图在这场长期的博弈中占据一些主动权。你提到国际社会的支持问题，实际上，台湾已经通过国际贸易和技术合作，与许多国家建立了紧密的联系。举个例子，台湾是全球半导体产业的重要一环，很多国家在经济上对台湾有一定的依赖。赖清德的策略或许可以利用这一点，进一步强化台湾的国际地位。
楚天舒，你这逻辑就像是在说，既然已经骑上了老虎，就不如继续骑下去。但现实是，老虎随时可能反咬一口。你提到台湾的半导体产业优势，可别忘了，这也是一把双刃剑。大陆也在加紧发展自己的芯片技术，一旦他们取得突破，台湾的这一优势将不复存在。你所说的国际合作，很多时候也是利益驱使，随时可能变卦。赖清德的纸老虎策略，不仅是在冒险，更是在拿台湾民众的未来做赌注。还不如脚踏实地，努力改善两岸关系，寻求真正的和平解决之道。
谢谢大家收看六度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
So what we're going to begin is a quick fire round of just short points, building on what came out of the Xi-Biden meeting in San Francisco at the end of last year. Then after that, we're going to do a deeper dive into many of the points that are raised in this first quickfire round. So I think many of us will remember that among the things that were supposed to have emerged from that Xi-Biden meeting, direct presidential hotline, fentanyl control, better understanding on fentanyl control, and the resumption of military communications. So there were other things that were mentioned, and obviously other things have happened in the months since then. So I'd just like to do a quick fire round on things that you see that have emerged from that you think continue to be hopeful, or things that have fizzled out and that you want to draw attention to, or new things that have emerged. So just quickly, Robin.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. I think the positive for me was that the meeting happened. You can tell I'm not setting my bar very high. But no, it was positive that it took place, that it reset Bali, the Bali G20 margins meeting, which had then been knocked off track with the various events that happened in between, the balloon incident, all those things. And so I think what was positive was that it happened. Don't think the list of achievements, in my opinion, was particularly high. I think since then we've seen how difficult it is for things to be positive. Trade relationship appears to have got worse, and the security situation seems to have got worse, despite their being able to talk to each other and having channels.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've been remiss. I should have also, when I go down this first round, quickly say a word about each of my wonderful panelists. So Sir Robin Niblett was formerly in charge of Chatham House. He's written a wonderful new book on the Cold War. We'll come back on many of these issues subsequently. Next, Ke Yu-jin, who's professor of economics at the London School of Economics and who has been a powerful voice in helping the rest of the world understand thinking and developments in China. Ke Yu.
I think that top American businessmen showing up at the top table conversing with President Xi, showing that China is still very important for American business, American businessmen, and that China is still open for business.
Okay, excellent, Kayu. Graham Ellison, who everybody at these meetings knows, he has taught at the Harvard Kennedy School for the last 5 decades, was founding dean. Everybody knows about the Thucydides trap, and many, many other researchers on this important relationship. Graham, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished panel. I'm a professor, so if I were grading San Francisco, I would give it an A-. I think it's significant. I think they laid a foundation, didn't just create a floor, but laid a foundation for a constructive, viable relationship. And that foundation, they rests on 3 pillars, 3 C's. Competition, fierce competition. Second, communication, candid private communication. And third, cooperation, serious cooperation on areas, particularly ones where each requires cooperation with the other for survival. So if I watch and see what's happened since San Francisco, the most important part for me is adults who understand they have serious differences and challenges, who are talking privately, candidly, even about subjects we don't know what they are, but in which they're about the most dangerous and difficult issues. And if I watch the behavior, so again, I don't know, I haven't seen a transcript of that conversation, though it went on for 4 hours between 2 presidents, and I know for sure it was a private, candid, very tough but clear conversation. I watch and see what happened in Taiwan with this transition. Both governments exercised extreme, even exquisite control. If I watched the number of military to military close encounters, it was going like this, and there's a sharp decline. So when you see a sharp break in a trend line, that usually is a clue. So I would suggest a number of things happened there, putting in place something that I regard as much more potentially positive.
Thank you, Graham.
Sorry, that's so long, but I think giving it an A- is a high mark.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Graham, and for calibrating what we mean by A- as well, because different academic standards around the world.
Yes, exactly.
But thank you very much.
Inflation has gone a long way. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Lin Kwok, a friend of mine from Singapore, but also now Lee Kuan Yew Chair of Southeast Asia Studies at Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Lin, your reading.
Thank you, Danny, and thanks also to the World Economic Forum for the invitation to be here today, and of course to be with everyone. On the San Francisco meeting, I would say that it is certainly an important first step, so I agree with Graham on that, in that respect. But I think there's still the question of how to translate that important first step into meaningful collaboration on the points agreed to. And of course, as Robin pointed out, many security issues remain. And of these, I think I would point out 2. First, on Taiwan, and we've had more strong warnings against foreign interference in Taiwan. And so the question, of course, is whether or not we are moving closer to a red line. And of course, that's concerning. And second, the South China Sea. And of course, we've seen, military, encounters at air and sea decrease between the United States and China, perhaps. But of course, we have skirmishes around Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. And this is dangerous because it could well draw the United States into the conflict, because it might trigger, in the event of an armed attack, it might trigger the Philippines-United States Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. So those are the things I would look out for.
Thank you very much, then. Li Cheng, director at the U.S.-based Center for U.S.-China Relations, and now professor of political science at the University of Hong Kong as well. Li Cheng, what's your reading?
I'm honored and humbled to be with this distinguished panel, but also with a wonderful audience. I will use the term, they found a flaw rather than found a foundation to prevent the free fall of U.S.-China relations. In that regard, they achieved that, but it's not the purpose to change the direction. I think the direction change probably will take a decade or so, a long time, because of a structural problem, because of lack of trust, even lack of mutual respect. I think I will emphasize three things the meeting achieved. One is the continuation of human control of nuclear weapon in the era of AI. This is profoundly important. Secondly, related is the male-to-male dialogue that we see already resume, although the real dialogue with AI is still in the very early stage. Thirdly, I think the high-level exchanges, especially the Blinken's visit, the Commerce Secretary visit, the NYU and the U.S. administration make it very clear it's U.S. interest to continue educational and cultural exchanges with China. Chinese leader Xi Jinping said the same thing, also with a commitment to sending, more Chinese students to the U.S. and having 50,000 American students to China. I think that is very, very important. At least the Biden administration and Chinese leadership reach a very solid agreement on that front.
Thank you, Li Cheng. A number of issues that have come up in this quick fire round I want to come back to, do a deeper dive on. But what I'm going to begin with, actually, are two statements from Graham and Lynn on your differentiated reading from San Francisco. So, and I want to focus that conversation, this discussion in particular, on the possibilities for cooperation because of a perception of common enemies, of common challenges. Historically, that's how powers and nations have been able to come together, even if they're at odds with each other, because there's something else that challenges the both of them. And on this front, I want first Lynn and then Graham to speak to this, which is that the world is not short of common enemies. We have pandemic issues that still remain. The global climate challenge is still outstanding and huge. There are even issues of international debt that plagues the world. So I wanted to maybe first hear from Lynn about these things which you might think of as a kind of non-traditional security challenge. What scope is there for cooperation between these two great powers? And after that, I'm going to turn to Graham on the same question. So Lynn, first.
Thanks, Danny. Well, first of all, I think I would say that I would prefer to use the term common challenges rather than common enemies. I think we must use language responsibly, and I think very often we tend to use language that is too heightened or too emotional. So let's stick to common challenges. So on common challenges, I think it's quite clear that the United States and China have many common challenges, and beyond US and China, I think the global community has common challenges to face, and you've pointed out some of them. And I think particularly for the United States and China, it's important for them to work on these common challenges together for two reasons. First, because it helps to address those issues, and that's important. And second, because it creates habits of communication, habits of practice and activities, which will hopefully help to improve relations. But if it doesn't help to improve relations, then at least it helps it from deteriorating further. So it's important that they work together, that's clear. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen is that even in the case where there is clear common interest in working together, like addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, the US and China failed to rise to that challenge, and that was disappointing. The Biden-Xi summit that you mentioned in November last year in San Francisco, that was an encouraging first step, as I said earlier, but I think in order to translate that encouraging first step on various non-traditional security issues, countering narcotics, climate change, as well as safety issues regarding AI. I think in order to translate that into meaningful collaboration, we need two conditions to be met. So number one, I think cooperation must not be held hostage to other issues. So I think it was disappointing in the wake of the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that dialogue on climate change as well as several other issues was suspended. And I think if we are to be serious about addressing some of these non-traditional threats, then we need to be able to continue doggedly with pursuit of resolution of those challenges without allowing other thorny issues to derail such conversations. And I think the other condition that must be met is that we need to be able to ensure that these issues do not become part of the broader geopolitical competition. But we saw in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that this itself became a battleground for strategic influence in Asia. So you had both countries competing to outdo the other in terms of handling the crisis, and we saw recriminations fly left, right, and center, and that was unfortunate. So I think it's clear that we will have to have political will to address these challenges. Will the US and China be able to rise to that challenge? I do not know, but what I do know, however, is that if we don't see them rise to that challenge, what we will have is challenges moving forward. We will not have resolution to these issues. And the other thing that we will have is a continued deterioration of great power competition. And I think that will continue nonetheless because of the structural issues that Li Cheng mentioned. But I think hopefully we can put a floor to some of the worsening, the worst impulses of that relationship.
Thank you, Lynn, for laying out that landscape so clearly. Graham, same question, but also perhaps I could get you to maybe dig a bit deeper into this idea of how, even with common challenges like the COVID pandemic, AI regulation, the global climate challenge, why has it been so difficult to come together to treat these challenges, even while remaining rivals in other domains?
So, big topic and a great topic, though. I think you're, as you did in the string before the session, you're onto a strategically big idea, which is, again, in geopolitics, historically, the enemy of my enemy is a friend. So if we look at history, the US and Europe were able to find common cause with Stalin's communist Soviet system, which they hadn't even been willing to recognize when they faced Hitler's Nazism. As Churchill said famously, if the devil were prepared to become involved, I would have a few good words to say about him. Okay? So the enemy of my enemy is a friend, and I would say, agree with Lynn, that a challenge, especially a challenge that may be a challenge to my survival. So that's point one. Point two, if we were to look at this, actually Ronald Reagan, again, apologies for his story, but it's a good story. So at one stage, Reagan was, after he got his mind around the fact that the two countries, the US and the evil empire, which he was sure was an evil empire, but nonetheless, they had nuclear arsenals that if they used them would destroy each other. So as he said famously, and is now part of the litany, a nuclear war cannot be won, because at the end of it you lost your own country, so must therefore never be fought. So now you and I have to find some way to do something to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay? So he was meeting with Gorbachev. This was at Geneva. I was there as a staff person. And he said to Gorbachev, if tomorrow we woke up, or this morning, and Martians had invaded the Earth, we would soon find ourselves shoulder to shoulder dealing. And the translator got the problem wrong to start with. And Reagan often talked, kind of elliptically. So the moderator wasn't sure whether Reagan thought Martians had invaded or not, so they got over that. But overall, look at the logic of it. If Martians invaded and were about to take over human beings, we would discover, lo and behold, whatever our differences are manageable. And I would say now, if we go to that to apply to the current situation, one big idea is the US and China today have nuclear arsenals just equivalent to what the US and the Soviet Union did. So they have a common shared interest in avoiding a nuclear war, of which the two would be the first victims. I believe President Biden and Xi have talked about that. I think at Bali they talked about that, the predecessor to San Francisco, and they're both very clear. We do not want a war, because at the end of a war, China would be destroyed and the US would be destroyed, and for what end for what purpose would that be, would that serve? Secondly, climate is a fascinating one that you mentioned and that Lynn suggested. If it is correct that we live in an enclosed biosphere on a small planet, and if your greenhouse gas emissions or mine, either of us, can make it uninhabitable for both of us. My survival requires somehow constraining me and you constraining yourself and figuring out some way to do that. We can go on down the list. Pandemics is another interesting example. So in principle, logic should suggest that if my survival requires some level of cooperation with you, however competitive we are, I'm going to manage a relationship that's both fiercely competitive and deeply cooperative. Now, there'll be trade-offs, and there'll always be a temptation to be short-sighted. So this doesn't absolve you from the requirement for serious statecraft, but in any case, it's a more manageable problem than if I really could bury you, or vice versa, and therefore it was an unconstrained rivalry.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's part of what drives the conversation that we're having about the possibilities for inadvertent cooperation, even if we are at odds with each other. The ideas here that throw out notions about economic rivalry, which I want to turn to Keryu next. On the narrative about the enemy of my enemy, the one that we said, ought to be driving some of this conversation. There was a time when America and China, before America and China became great friends, Nixon wrote this powerful piece in Foreign Affairs about how the world cannot tolerate a nation of 1 billion people living in angry isolation. And that opened the doors to this kind of collaboration subsequently. But there are people who say that, well, do not think that was the milk of human kindness flowing out of Richard Nixon. It was that both of them were staring down a Soviet Union that was a common enemy. So there are many other issues here to unpack. But you've introduced, both you and Lynn have introduced the ideas that, well, there are different domains, and some of those domains, competition might be a good thing. In economics, Keryu, we often like the idea that competition is what drives all of us to be better. That competition in the economic domain is actually something to be welcomed. How do you, as an economist, looking at the changes that are going on in economic production structures across America and China, the innovation that's happening in these two great economies, how do you square that with the kind of inability to come up with some forms of cooperation, if only implicit? Keryu.
Thank you, Danny. Well, first observation is that one of the most striking patterns in the US economy is the reduction in competition and the rise in concentration in the last few decades. And that has led to, or certainly a factor of declining productivity and potential innovation capacity. This is a big deal. But before I turn to that, and just following up on some of the aspects that were raised, climate, that is the major area of cooperation. Let's face it, let's be real. $5 trillion gap in emerging markets, developing countries, that needs to be filled for sustainable investment, green investment until 2030. 45 million EVs needed by then. So let's not talk about overcapacity. 600 million people in Africa without electricity. And by 2030 or a few years later, more than half, or maybe by 2040, more than the majority of the source of energy is coming from solar. So whether it's industrial policy, whether it's national mobilization, I don't think it's a bad thing that all these countries are doing more investment, especially on the innovation part, because that is the real question we are talking about. Now, also a connecting point is post-war universal moral universality, US, right? Based on values. Let's also have incorporated a Chinese world vision, which is the dignity of living, higher living standards. That's the majority of people living in the world. 90%, something like 90% of the people still live in developing countries. And all these facts that we've mentioned, investments into developing countries have decreased from advanced economies since last year, or the last few years, 9% decrease over the last. This is a major, major problem. And so coming back to, we like to frame the kind of global race as competition, industrial policies, return of industrial policies, China spending hundreds of billions of dollars on high tech, same thing with US, but by the way, same thing with Japan, Europe's Green New Deal, and many others around the world. That needs to not be viewed as protectionism, right? It's not, policies to strengthen one's own country, one's own innovation system, but also together more investment for the developing world is very important. And I think that if we get very specific, again, one of the issues is, let's not talk about US-China as black or white. It's not like that, right? Let's talk about issues. Let's talk about mechanisms, and let's find ways to solve specific issues. And so I think that's kind of the economic part is really important. And coming back to competition, I think competition is very much needed for the reasons that we mentioned. America has less and less competition over time. China actually has ferocious competitiveness levels. I think its competitiveness rankings has risen 7 places or so in the last year. Just look at all the, and I think that is one key part of the innovative entrepreneurialism that is going on. And so as we move forward, I think, part of, I think, the positive aspects of this is that everyone has their act together again. And there is more focused effort on the things that we talked about, more focused effort on innovation, but especially around technology. We need to have more conversations about AI regulations, about data regulation. I do believe that this is a phenomenal opportunity for the developing world to embark on the digital economy, maybe even leapfrog, where their physical infrastructure is also in a deficit of trillions of dollars. They might be able to leapfrog the traditional industries and be able to climb up the value chain, because one of the threats for them is that can they still manufacture their way out of poverty? Thank you.
Thank you, Ke. You've introduced for us such a wonderful panorama of the global economic landscape. So many problems to be solved, so many challenges. But if I may, let me press you a little bit. Because if the idea here is we're trying to understand why great powers have not been able to come together to compete in a sensible way, to produce the 25 million EVs that we need, it's not that it's impossible to understand the hesitation and the circumspection that they feel. And let me spin this story. As economists, we like to say, well, there's a need, the global supply chain needs to provide it. In providing it, all of us are better off. International trade makes all of us better off. And while policymakers at a global level, economists like yourself, and sometimes like myself, can talk about these comparative advantage, the lived experience of ordinary people does not always conform with that. The lived experience of, say, everyday Americans in the Midwest, they're looking at a bleaker landscape. They're seeing shuttered factories. They're seeing jobs being shed. They're seeing control of technologies of the future being run by somebody else now. And so there's that fear. And in that fear, you can say, well, what we should be doing is investing more in infrastructure, educating our people, upskilling the workforce. We can say that. But the immediate reaction of many political leaders is that those are longer term. In the meantime, I've got to be seen to be doing something. And that doing something is more often than not lashing out at the other. What is the economic story we should be telling this side of the global conversation?
Well, first of all, let's not forget pro-growth agenda, right? Let's put this front and center. Right? There's a return of politics. It used to be that economics drive politics in the Western world. Now it's the other way around. Don't give up the pro-growth agenda, and this is true for all the major countries we're thinking about, and also some of the smaller countries. Second, the return of the importance of trade. Trade, despite all these dislocations that we mentioned, but we're confounding a lot of the causes of trade and the causes of technology. A lot of it is just pure structural change leading to some of these dislocations, and also governments not doing enough, right, to help their citizens transition. But trade is front and center. It creates jobs. It's the source of productivity growth. This is what developing countries and most of these countries, smaller countries, will have to rely on. And speaking about trade, let's not kid ourselves. There's no way US and China can really decouple. It is the largest and second largest economy in the world. It is the biggest sources of demand and supply of all major things. And even if we've seen a trade restructuring or rerouting, where there's a little bit less direct trade between US and China, they're only one country away in terms of linkages. They're rerouted from countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Southeast Asia. This also gives more opportunities to other nations. But there's only one country away. And right now, in the last 10 or 20 years, we are in a global network. We've seen how with pandemic, with any kind of geopolitical shocks, one shock from one country propagates throughout the network. It's going to go from US to China through other countries, but they're still deeply embedded with each other. And we've seen also reorganization of capital flows, some of more capital flowing, let's say, to India, to Southeast Asia. I think global capital flows are still largely politically neutral. They will be searching for returns, and they'll be searching for diversification. So again, these two economies are the largest in the world. They are, in fact, even if indirectly, inseparable.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I want to turn that conversation into one about Cold War narrative, which has sometimes emerged. But Graham, you wanted to react?
One footnote on the point.
Certainly, yeah.
So I agree completely with just what was said, but I think if you read the book by Robert Lighthizer, who was the trade representative for Trump, and who will be the key economic assistant to Trump, and he's written now a book about No Trade is Free. That's the name of it. And he explains his theory of the case, which is that this trading system has been optimized for production and consumption. So the reason why, as an American, I can go to Walmart's or Home Depot and get something at half the price I would otherwise is that there's been an optimized system. Okay? But he believes that instead, that system should be ended, in his view, in favor of a system that tries to optimize the well-being of the citizens, who would be the employees, the guys in your factory that you were talking to, or otherwise. He, I think, gets confused about how much that's going to cost, since when you go to Walmart's, it'll cost you half as much again, or maybe more.
Yeah.
And I think he gets confused again about this mythology of the American worker who was on the car line and so forth. But this is a serious thought now, and with a serious plan, and that's what drives the claim by Trump that he would end up putting tariffs at a level in which there would be no imbalance of trade between the US and China. Now, the disruption that would cause, we would need an economist to explain to us, but I think it's at least worth noting what's beneath the question that you were...
No, Graham, that's an excellent observation. And I might suggest that there's actually a sliding scale, a spectrum, a variable range between the pictures of economies performing well and economies running in a costly way, but falsely claiming how they are serving ordinary people. Even in conventional trade ideas, trade works because it changes price ratios. Every time prices change, someone will see price move against them. Someone is going to be angry, even if at the end of it all, for exactly the reasons that Ke has described, all of us actually benefit. But in the immediate short term, someone's going to feel shortchanged. And I think that if we're going to be serious about thinking about how we move forwards on cooperation, we need to have a narrative about how we alleviate the disruption there. And it's not 100 miles different from the way conventional economics thinks about inequality, about perturbations in inequality and poverty reduction. But I think that there's plenty to unpack here. But one of the things that's come out in this last part of the conversation, is the importance with which we explain things to people, how ordinary people understand these changes going out there, because we cannot ignore them, whether we live in functioning liberal democracies or whether we live in non-functioning democracies. The views of ordinary people do matter. So I wanted to bring Li Cheng and Robin into the conversation here, because the two of you have thought about political relationships. Robin, you have most recently thought about how we reinterpret and we leverage the lessons from the Cold War. Because the Cold War introduced a narrative of how the enemy was seeking to replace our way of life. The enemy was seeking to damage our government. And no matter how many times we tell people, in trading partnerships, Beijing has no view on how America runs its government. And Beijing has no view on how Americans want to live their life. But nonetheless, there's a conflation of these political and economic narratives. And I wanted to bring first Robin and then Li Cheng into the conversation here about how we tell these political stories. Perhaps with a Cold War sort of perspective, what's the new way we should be thinking about the dangers from that kind of inappropriate interpretation, how we drive towards greater collaboration?
Well, thank you, Danny, for laying it out that way. I mean, the reason I put the title on the book is I think we've got to call a spade a spade. So the first thing about the narrative, the dynamic, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in my interpretation, I don't think there's a desire or a focus on the part of the Chinese government to want to overthrow American democracy. However, there's a perception in the United States in particular, but I'd say probably shared in parts of Europe as well, that the insecurity that they believe the Communist Party feels about its own long-term governance and survival of China is one that may lead it then to make sure that other countries aren't too strong to challenge it or to undermine it. That countries that are run this way by one-party states tend to have an element of insecurity in them that can then lead them to want to project that insecurity and make sure that they're secure internally. You push, in Russia's case, boundaries outwards, but in China's case, you make sure you push influence outwards into your nearby region. And the US, for all of its own reasons, sees itself as a bulwark of stopping that particular expansion of influence. And by trying to stop that expansion of influence, and if you look at the last few years, and even the time since the San Francisco summit, the US efforts to strengthen its alliances with the Philippines, try to bring Japan and South Korea together as they've done in the recent agreement. Of course, that then is seen as, in Beijing, as actually directed against it and trying to undermine it. Of course, the US thinks it's supporting allies and preventing Beijing from extending its influence. I mean, we've been here before. There is a sense that each side sees the other as a deeper threat, almost inevitably because of the difference in their systems of government. And you can see right now in TikTok and the US administration effort to get ByteDance to sell TikTok, sell its interest to a US owner, a fear that somehow the fact that there's a different algorithm allowed in China compared to the one that's being deployed in the United States is done for nefarious reasons. It is to undermine US democracy. So, I mean, we can go in, don't sit and understand the motivations of all leaders, definitely not in Beijing. But I think the reality is the two sides are not just confronting each other as military competitors, they are confronting each other in a form of way as ideological competitors. Not communism versus capitalism, that's not the issue here, and I think you said the capitalism instinct is pretty rampant in China when you look at how companies have to fight to survive. But it is between top-down governance and bottom-up governance. And those two systems are not compatible together. So I think you've got to call a spade, and that is why, to go back to the earlier part, there's no point talking about common enemies. I wouldn't say even common challenges. I mean, we can talk about them. They're real. We should do this. We should do that. The US and China should cooperate. Should doesn't get you anywhere, I'm afraid, in today's world. They see each other in zero-sum terms. We're back to zero-sum perceptions. So you then have, if you accept that reality, which I think is important to do, then you need to look for the space for cooperation. So let's just be very practical. If you're thinking about health, you put health on the list. I'm afraid the perception is in Washington, certainly, that the sources of the virus have not been fully explained in Beijing. That is the view, and the latest report that came out just about a month ago believes that it's sourced somehow, maybe even with US funding, I might add, from the laboratory in Wuhan. That's been put out there. Your ability then to cooperate on virus preparation is going to be severely constrained. There's no point we should cooperate on health. We won't in that area. But maybe you could cooperate on antimicrobial resistance. Huge global challenge. Maybe you could cooperate, as America and China have done, on testing. Find the areas that are practical, that are outside the lane of the zero-sum competition, that are outside the lane of what might be a misinterpretation of each side's motivations, but they nonetheless are definitely politically real. Climate, I'd say, is the same thing. We should all be facing the common challenge of climate change. Absolutely. But right now, it is seen that the more competitive China is in EVs, the more it is undermining American global economic competitiveness, but also dominance of critical minerals. There's a fear of depending on China's capability in these areas. So you've got to find sort of different space. Maybe we need to cooperate on carbon capture and storage. Maybe we've got to cooperate on efficiency gains that can be achieved in buildings. You've got to separate out, your expectations, and secondly, the lanes need to be lanes that don't tip over into a perception of how you're strengthening the other side in geopolitical and ideological competition. It's very difficult to do, but it is the reality. We are in a zero-sum world. If you're in a zero-sum world, you need answers to find the absolute gains in very targeted areas. And I think there are targeted areas. I'm normally the optimist on these panels, but I'm finding I need to put some of the negative down first. And again, that's why, and let me just put one last example, because I know we'll be short on time, to Kiyu's point about Africa and poverty there. Absolutely. But it is a zone of competition. The view is, either China will dominate the mineral imports, or, hell, we're late. Europeans and Americans are waking up to the fact that we need it there. And so long as the IMF has dominant US and European voting weights, and that's not going to change and didn't change back in last December, it's going to be hard to work on debt forgiveness. But actually, that's one part of the world where competing may be good. The fact that we fell behind means we're now going to compete to try to bring our own infrastructure investment into that part of the world. So maybe the competition, even in a sort of Cold War-ish context, might be good for those countries. They will leverage our competition for their own advantage, and go for it as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Robin. Li Cheng, I want to turn to you in a minute, but I wanted to follow up, if I may, a number of things that Robin said, that you said so wonderfully, that the fact of the matter is, we can't deny it, there is a perception of the two great powers being locked in zero-sum competition. The fences that we've built demarcate that. So what we're trying to do here, and what you've tried to do in this intervention, is look for the gaps in those fences. Where are those? And they're not going to come from grand pronouncements about how, we must cooperate, otherwise we're all going to die. We're not going to get anywhere with that. We need to look for small gaps, small areas. Now, you've told us about health, and you told us about climate. I wonder if I could just as we finish here with your intervention, say a word or two about AI regulation and digital technologies. Is there any room there, or is that so set on security considerations we're firmly locked in zero-sum?
Look, I'm not an expert in AI governance, and AI itself is sufficiently complicated for me. There are many people in this room and on this panel who know a lot more than I do. The commanding heights of technology are the commanding heights of economic capability, but also of military capability. And if you're in a zero-sum environment, that is going to be a zone of competition. So just to be save time and leave time for others to speak on the panel and to come back in, I would say that hoping that we're going to cooperate in a grand scheme of AI governance at a time when each side is trying to make sure that they have the strength to be able to compete with each other, is going to be incredibly difficult. So where AI governance, maybe some of the seams are, to keep on going with my theme that you've got to look for the gaps. One, which I think Graham was alluding to early on, is trying to find areas where you will not permit AI to interfere. So command and control systems for nuclear command and control is an area that apparently was discussed, as I think Graham noted a second ago, in San Francisco. Now, you'd have to have some type of verification. Took a long time to get verification in the last Cold War. And of course, Putin has removed it now because he knows lack of transparency is a form of strength. With the limited trust there is on the two sides, I'm a little bit worried about that, but I think that is an area we should and must be focused on. Allowing autonomous weapons to be fully autonomous. One thing that's come out of the war in Ukraine is a realization that anti-drone technology, electronic warfare, is extremely powerful. And therefore, you send off your drone, it doesn't get to its target after a while. If it doesn't get to its target, well, if it was autonomous, then it wouldn't matter if there was EW against it. So why not have autonomous drones? Well, once you get there, you're on a slippery slope. So I think you need to find some very particular seams to try and make sure we're there. And I suppose ultimate full harms, the danger that AI would spread out into extreme forms of weapons development, that maybe is the seam that we need to find in that area. But generally, technology, data management, I'm afraid I see a bifurcated world emerging. Okay. And we're at the front end. Sadly, we're at the beginning, in my opinion, of a new Cold War. Because we're at the beginning, we don't have the rules, we don't have the trust, we don't have the experience yet, which I think Graham and others have been saying, Lynn and so on, we're trying to find at the moment. Okay. Sorry, I'll stop there.
So thank you. That ties in very well with what's been said, the possibilities, and also the caution and circumspection that we need to approach this. Li Cheng, I want to bring you in on sort of a political science perspective on the issues that, some quite economic issues that we've been discussing. Areas for cooperation from your perception.
Well, first of all, I think their question really touched a very important issue about the strategic objective or mistakes on the part of Washington or the Western world. But before that, let me comment on your early comments about the enemies and friends. I think that sometimes these terms go without ironies or paradoxes. I think Henry Kissinger said it best. He said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be an ally of the United States is fatal. So I think there's a lot of audience from Europe and from America, from Asia, they know what I mean in light of the American election, very soon, debate tonight. Now, you look at Washington, the Republican hawkish really want to defeat China. The term they use, there's no ambiguity, look at foreign affairs, foreign policy. I mean, I just really shocked by how out of touch with the reality of China, how outdated that the concept, they still use, as the previous panelists said so well, I do not want to repeat. Now, Democrats, no officials say the regime change or defeat China, but they do say want to slow down China. I think this is also a bad narrative. And as Bill Gates said, whenever you want to slow down China, you only accelerate the indigenous innovation. In some areas, China already catch up, like material science, material development. China is way ahead of the United States. You look at the scientific papers. In other areas, China catching up. For example, aerospace, NASA kicked off China 11 years ago out of the moon station, but now China can establish its own. But the problem is, I think it's the narrative, authoritarianism versus democracy. In my view, it's too simplistic, too narrow-minded, too ideological. Of course, early on said too outdated. But most importantly, too dangerous. Not only dangerous to the world, major power, but even dangerous to the United States. Dr. Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter said 28 years ago in his classic book that talk about the one of the most, this is after the victory of the Cold War. He believes that one of the most dangerous scenario for the United States, probably the most dangerous scenario, is Russia, China, Iran come together. Not because of a common ideology, but a common need to deal with American pressure. If that's the case, United States will face three enemies, and from the east, from the west, from the south. Is that the area that the era or scenario we want to enter? Unfortunately, we're moving that direction. Now, many people probably think that it's only U.S. fault, because it's a more complicated environment. But the question is, when we talk about Thucydides' trap, when the existing power and the rising power, which one is more nervous or feel more fearful? The answer, I think, most people will come to the same or similar answer. Now, at least China talked about peaceful coexistence. Tomorrow, there will be a major meeting in Beijing. Xi Jinping, Li Qiang, Wang Yi will speak. I think you probably will go to that meeting, me too. But at least they talk about peaceful coexistence. That resonates well with the global south, with many other countries. So my view is, U.S. need to review the narrative and to serve its best interest. This is what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Li Cheng. I want Lin to come in, and then after that, if there are any other sort of immediate points to be made, I'm happy to take that from the panel. But otherwise, I'd like to bring the audience into the conversation. So Lin first, and then perhaps the audience.
Thanks, Danny. Yes, I wanted to echo what I see as the danger of this Cold War narrative, the authoritarianism versus democracy. I think it's such a flawed narrative, and unfortunately, it really has taken root over the last few years. I think it's flawed for several reasons. First, because it unnecessarily deepens tensions between the United States and China. If we're talking about trade disputes or technology disputes, or even disputes over how to better handle climate change, then we can resolve those particular issues as long as the other side isn't seen to be an ideological enemy. But when the other side is like the evil one or the enemy, then it becomes very hard to solve even these difficult but still solvable issues. And let's not forget that the US and China coexisted peacefully for decades with differing systems of governance. So I think that's an important point to make. Second, I think as Cheng-Li highlighted, this Cold War narrative pushes authoritarian countries who might have more differences between themselves than with the United States. It pushes them closer together, and that's dangerous for the United States as well. And also for the United States, it complicates its partnerships in Asia. So in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, the US highlights countries like Singapore, Vietnam, etc. as important partners in the region. And of course, these are not liberal democracies. So how does this help with its framing of what's happening in the world? The fourth reason I would say is that if democracy is important to the United States, and I think it should be, then does this narrative actually work in a counterproductive fashion to push some countries who are uncomfortable with this narrative closer to the other side rather than the United States? So are you pushing them away from your embrace? So I think that's problematic. And I kind of think that this narrative emerged from the United States, unfortunately, but I think China has not helped itself in that respect. China does talk about peaceful coexistence, and I think that's very much appreciated. However, I think for instance, the joint statement between Russia and China right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that didn't help China's case, because even if China isn't supporting Russia, what we do see is perceptions of China, and that has really hardened in terms of the West seeing China as supporting Russia and therefore being on the other side of the fence. I'd like to point out a recent poll in my part of the world in Southeast Asia, where China recently edged past the United States in terms of who respondents in Southeast Asia chose if they had to choose a power between the United States and China, who they had to choose. So 50.5% said they would choose China now, and this is the first year this has happened. Usually they choose the United States. And I think if I were China and I were thinking about its priority is really, or its concern is really its strategic competition with the United States, its dealings with the United States. How does it best achieve a sort of response to the United States? And I think that's making more friends. If I were China, I would be seeking as quickly as possible to settle, if not the territorial disputes, but the maritime disputes with its neighbors in Southeast Asia, because I think that's the sticking point to actually consolidating China's position in Southeast Asia, which is in fact very strong, as the poll shows, but it can be further consolidated if it were to make nice with its neighbors on the South China Sea issues. So if I were China and thinking, trying to think strategically about these issues, this is how I would respond.
Thank you very much. Graham.
So I agree, most agree with, but let me go back to, I think, where you were. If I were to try to characterize what I think is a view that's substantially shared by both Biden and Xi about what's going on, I think it is that this is a long-term rivalry in which there are irresolvable differences because it really matters who settles disputes in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. If the US were to withdraw from the region, we would see these matters would be settled between the parties rather quickly in one terms, in the same way that if the US is to withdraw from Europe, we'll see that the Russian-Ukraine thing will be settled quite quickly on Russian terms. So it matters. It matters whether Hong Kong is ruled by British rule or Chinese rule. So there's a lot of issues here. So it's going to be fiercely competitive, and that's not going to go away.
Right.
At the same time, it's going to be intensely cooperative because each of the nations, I think they each understand, each of their nations' survival, not just their well-being, not just what's good, their survival depends on dealing with a common challenge or adversary. First, not having a general nuclear war. Second, climate. Third, probably the financial system has gotten now so entangled, it's not destruction, but it's certainly a depression. So can you be both rivals and partners at the same time? That's the exploration I've been on for some time. Yeah. I think actually in Chinese history, you find examples, and in Chinese philosophy, lots of more nuanced complexity in which it's not black and white or either or. It's Wu and Yue, two guys in a boat who are deadly adversaries, but the ship on which they're sailing sinks. They find themselves in a rowboat that's too wide for either of them to hold both oars. So they have to cooperate to row together to survive. Well, I would say that's an interesting example. I like the rivalry partnership concept in the Sung dynasty with the Sung and the Liao. So you look and you say, how in the world can you be both my fierce rival and my partner at the same time? The answer is, well, it's complex. Life is complex. If you ask Tim Cook, this is an interesting case, which I have done. So Apple is a fierce competitor with Samsung for selling smartphones. But who is Apple's principal supplier? Samsung. So you say, well, wait a minute, how can one of your fiercest rivals be your essential supplier?
Yeah.
He says, life is complicated.
Yeah, yeah. I like the life is complicated meme. It opens up possibilities. It's when we drive the conversation to binaries, to 0-1, right or wrong, with me or against me, that we get into these challenges that we don't see a way forwards. So much wisdom in this panel, but I'd like to see if the audience, I see the audience is quite engaged. Do we have microphones to, okay, so first the gentleman in the back, and then over here, and then the lady in front. So, and then I know there are others, we'll come back to you if possible. So the three of you, questions for the panel. Three of you go first, and then the panel will respond. Okay, sir.
Question for Professor Allison. So we know that the Sino-US relationship is facing some challenges, and the subsidies trap is coming up likely in a cold way, but not in a hot way. So what's your opinion? And for Professor Jin Keyue, do you expect there will be more soft words after the US election, given that there has been already some tariffs on China this year? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over here, please. I know we're desperately running short of time, so make your questions short and punchy, and we'll do as much as we can.
Thank you so much. Very briefly, do you see a role for the swing states, if you will, those countries that either because of their political representation in the world or economic sway might be able to maintain relations to both poles, UAE, Brazil, and others? Do you see a role? What could it be?
Thank you. And then in front here, final question, and then I come back to the panel, please.
We know there will be a presidential debate between the two candidates tonight in the US. So I want to know what is the most worrying impact if one of them is elected to China and US relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, given the way the time is, I know questions have been directed at Keyue and Graham, but can we just, after Graham and Keyue, everybody get a say in on any aspect of these questions? Then I'm afraid we're going to have to end. So Graham and then Keyue.
So great questions. Briefly, so the Thucydides trap conversation has advanced quite far, and I think President Xi Jinping has been wrestling with the question how to escape Thucydides trap. And he has this line that he's used repeatedly in which he says, well, I am in you and you are in me. He did this when the Senator Schumer and his delegation came in October, and that was very confusing to him. When they came back, a couple of them called me and said, what the hell is going on? What is he talking about? I said, I don't quite know, but let me look into it. Turns out this is actually a Chinese saying over many, many years. You could go even back to the Sun Tzu period. So it means that we are so intertwined that we may face some common challenges or common threats that require a degree of and manner of cooperation. I think that's actually a good idea and a productive area. On the debate, I would say, hold your breath. The campaign is at a stage where it's very hard. Most Americans mostly agree that they're opposed to one of the other candidates. So it's a division between not enthusiasm for candidate A or B, but fear or abhorrence of candidate B rather than candidate A. So there'll be a effort to do sound bites and images that play to the imagery in the current campaign. Mm-hmm. And you should think of the current campaign as a version of theater in which you shouldn't get confused by being literal about what people say. And on China, you can be certain that there'll be extreme China bashing. But as I say to my Chinese friends, however ugly that appears, notice that however nasty either of them is about China, they will have something even nastier to say about their American opponent.
Thank you very much, Graham. Keyue.
Tariff wars are more political posturing than anything else. China's exports of the renewables EVs to the US is insignificant in comparison to its export to Europe. And also in terms of the renewables, EVs, et cetera, it only constitutes around 5% of total Chinese exports worldwide.
Thank you. So we're going to finish up now with your response or your final thoughts. Lee Cheng, Lin, and then Robin.
For other countries, I do believe, particularly Europe and Asia, they do not have the hegemonic ambition or complex that's different from the United States. And many countries also economically more relying on China. Just to give the example of UK, actually, I just want to share with you one number. You know, Jingyu gave a lot of very, very important number to think about that. UK's trade with Hong Kong, a city, is larger now and last year than UK trade with Japan, the third largest economy. Think about that. And yes, in environment, nuclear non-proliferation, and many other issues. They actually welcome China's development, but they're under pressure with China's kind of ever-growing power. Now, the question about the two candidates, I think neither of them is good for China. But the nature of their differences also will have a negative impact on China. I want to also add, neither of them is good for the United States. I'm deeply worried. I think that the real interest is not to see the world as a zero-sum game, and both sides benefit from the other's confidence, others' stability. But we're not seeing that at the moment. So that's the terrible period we're just entering.
Thank you, Li-Cheng. Lynn.
Yeah, I'd like to address the question on the swing states. It's a very important one, so thank you for asking that. I look at the question in two respects, right? So first, what can these other states do vis-a-vis the US-China relationship? And second, what can these states do vis-a-vis the smaller countries who are impacted by US-China competition? So on the first point, I'm part of a WEF Council on Geopolitics, which Robin is also a member of, and Bruce Jones, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning, but who has been at this meeting. And we produced a report earlier this year that talked about the role of middle powers. Sorry, Danny is also on this council. I should have mentioned that from the outset. And so we produced this report on, and part of it addressed the role of middle powers. And this report recommended the establishment of some sort of coalition of the capable or ad hoc grouping of major Western and non-Western powers who will play an important role in terms of moderating tensions in US-China competition. If the US and China start undermining the rule of law, undermining the multilateral order, these middle powers can step in to moderate their worst impulses. They can also establish quiet diplomatic channels for the US and China to lower their rhetoric and lower tensions. So I think that's one important role that other powers can play. The second important role that they can play is vis-a-vis the smaller countries who are caught in the middle of US-China competition. They don't want to choose between the United States if given a choice. And other powers, say Europe, Japan, Canada, India, these countries can all play an important role in expanding the strategic and economic options for smaller countries, because the rule of law is really important. It's really the backbone of economic progress and prosperity, as well as security. And the rule of law can only be supported and defended in real and concrete terms if countries actually have the real option of adhering to the rule of law and supporting the rule of law and defending the rule of law. So having these economic options and strategic options expanded by middle powers, I think that's critical for the region. And I think if we look at polls in the region, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, you'll see that in this respect, Europe as a grouping fares very well, and so does Japan. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. We're way out of time, Robin. A punchline to take us out.
Yeah, punchlines, 3 punchlines, but very quick. My biggest worry, closer relations and the perception of closer relations between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It is an absolute driver of a lot of the negative feeling in Western capitals about where we are in this rivalry. It's happening. I don't know what China does about it, but my biggest worry, one of my biggest worries. My second biggest worry, my second point, depending on who wins the US presidential election, we will have a US with allies or a US without allies. And I think Kissinger, who's not always right, by the way, was wrong. Being an ally of the US has not been fatal for European countries. It's been a fantastic bonus, continues to be. But if Trump comes in, he doesn't care about allies. He has to be nice to them. And that's not something he likes doing. So that would be my worry. My positive is exactly where Lynn was. And on the swing states are the discipline on the geopolitical rivalry. I think India is playing its hand especially well. The G20 becomes very important in this, especially with the African Union in it. So I see real hope. I think all those countries that are known as countries of the Global South are actually part of the positive solution that'll keep us focused on the global challenges that we've talked about here. Because in the Global North, we're stuck in a competition. Yeah. But the Global South is saying, health, food security, environment, focus on it, and I think they'll make us do it.